Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. People who are pretty sure they encountered a serial killer. What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My mom was living in LA when a man pulled her into his van. He spent the next 2 weeks driving around with her tied up, doing the unspeakable to her. One day he just let her go, told her he'd be back for her, so she up and moved across the state. I'm so happy my mom is still with me. I coached his kids' soccer team for a few years. His kids were fun-loving goofballs that had 2 left feet. He worried that people would pick on them. Once he stuck around to offer support when we had a parent acting up because the dude was huge. My kids were in his wife's class in elementary school. She was a really nice lady. She left town, and no one heard anything from her after he was arrested for strangling prostitutes. Traveling out of state for a vacation with my kids at a gas station, this man starts trying to talk to my younger daughter. I immediately got between them, but not before my daughter blurted out exactly where we were going and how long we would be there. I suddenly felt sick. Something about the guy scared me. I just knew there was going to be a problem. I hustled the kids back to the car and waited to drive away out of fear he might follow us. I didn't see him come out, so eventually I drove off, but I was paranoid about it afterwards. 2 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone banging aggressively on our door. He was screaming that he was with security for the complex and that there was an intruder seen in the area, so I was required by law to open the door. Obviously, I didn't fall for that. He started swearing and threatening me. Suddenly, he just stopped. Suddenly, something spooked him, and he turned and bolted. He had been standing kind of off to the side and reaching over to bang on the door in a way that I couldn't see his face. When he moved, I saw it. It was the guy from the gas station. He followed us through 2 states. The actual security for the complex drove around but never found him. There was a broken gate next to the condo that they said he got in through. Whilst I was at university, I worked at a cafe in a local shopping center. One of our regular customers was a mom and son who would come have breakfast most mornings. The mom was delightful. However, the son always seemed a bit off. Nothing major. You'd just say, "Have a great day," and he'd reply with, "Yes." Anyway, one day he comes in without his mom and has breakfast. The next day his face is all over the news. He had just been arrested for murdering his mom. I don't know if a serial killer, but definitely a trafficker or child predator. Some background. My stepdad was a truck driver, so often we would visit him at a local truck stop when he was near to grab breakfast, etc. My mother is not great. During one of these adventures, my mom decided she wanted us to stay with stepdad in the truck. Sister was 11, and I was 9. During this 2-week period, lol, we were in a random truck stop in Georgia. My sister and I went to take a shower, because we hadn't for days, and shared a shower to save on money. I was out and waited in the hallways for my sister. A man came up to me and started asking questions. This happened in the early 2000s, so I'd been taught stranger danger, but I was also still being taught to always be respectful to adults' bullshit. I was giving him basic answers, but then he pushed, showing me his truck. My tiny self was terrified, but I kept saying, "No, I can't." Eventually he got annoyed and just grabbed my arm and started pulling me. In that moment, my sister came out and snatched my ass back, and we ran. Crying, I told my mom. I'm called overly dramatic. If my sister hadn't seen me, I'm positive I would have never been seen again. Yeah, Mom doesn't sound great. 2 weeks on the road with your stepdad. Little out there. You might not have disappeared, but I don't think that person had good intentions for you. Not me, but my uncle. His manager at the fast food place where he worked in high school invited him and another kid over to his place after work. My uncle and his friend declined, and were very glad they did years later when it became public what exactly his former manager, John Wayne Gacy, was doing, and with those kids he invited over. He was not a serial killer, but he killed more than half of a whole family. I paid him to remove a problematic tree that I wasn't confident about cutting down without dropping it on my home. He convinced me to save the tree and just remove a few limbs that were dangerous. He just seemed like a dude. A month later, he murdered everyone in the house except the young girl whom he had abducted. He stuffed the bodies of their mother, mother's friend, and son into the hollow of a tree. When his home was later searched, it was full of piles of leaves and wallpapered to make it look like trees, and the abducted girl was locked in the basement, Ohio. Not a serial killer, but became part of a well-known missing person case in my state. I used to work with him, and he wasn't there long, but he just had this dead look in his eyes and was always in an I don't give up attitude. He butted heads with my wife, who was a supervisor there at the time, and at one point he went up to her and tried to be this tough, cold asshole to scare her. It got me. I just never wanted them to be close together when I couldn't be there because I was scared for her. He eventually got fired, and then a handful of years later, we saw he was the killer of a missing person and ended up having a shootout with the cops and dying a full state away. A few years ago, my mother took my son, who was about 6 at the time, to get Santa photos done. A few months later, Toronto police arrested him. He had murdered several men. He ran a landscaping company and was hiding the bodies in the ground and planting potters for the jobs he was doing, and also working as a mall Santa. The thing that's messed up for me is that I'm aware of his actions, but somewhere a family has a photo of their child on his lap, completely unaware, with a full-fledged serial killer on display. He wasn't one when I met him. I worked a retail job that sold iPhones at a high-end mall. Guy comes in carrying a Nordstrom bag, wearing Gucci sunglasses, and asks to buy an iPhone. While I waited for our back-of-house team to bring the iPhone, I was having a casual conversation with the guy. I ask what he does for work, and he says he's an actor. I ask if he's been in anything I might have seen. He says the Hunger Games. I say, cool, who did you play? He mumbles something about being one of the tributes. The conversation somehow leads to him asking if I'm single. I told him I was engaged, and he was visibly annoyed. His attitude was very arrogant, and he did a lot of uncomfortable or creepy staring that I noticed after he took off his sunglasses. I had initially asked him if he was eligible for an upgrade on his phone, and he was confident that he was. Well, after checking his ID, standard protocol, and pulling up the account, nope, not eligible. But his brother's phone was eligible. He insists that he can use his brother's upgrade, but I tell him that stuff just needs to be approved by the main account holder or authorized user. So he calls his stepmom and asks to use the brother's upgrade. His stepmom says no, and the guy throws a complete tantrum. He says that his brother is too young for an iPhone anyway, that he's fine using an older model, and that he needs a new phone. Stepmom doesn't budge, yet I'm stuck there for at least 20 minutes while this guy yells at his stepmom, trying desperately to get his way. He leaves in a huff, and I'm so relieved to get away from this entitled prick. The guy was Elliot Rodger. I met the murderer of Grace Mullane, not a serial killer, but on the day he was figuring out how to hide the body. So the night after he killed her, he came into the block of shops I was working at and was looking for a suitcase. He stopped by my store and asked, but didn't buy them. So he went to the warehouse next to me. That week I got stopped numerous times going home as the police were looking for a shovel, only to find out the shovel was across our store at the car wash as he left it in there. I even talked to the employee and was wondering why there was a muddy shovel left in one of his slots. You can see in the videos that he is taking the suitcase in the elevator, which was bought in the store next to mine. The fact that he looked normal, acted normal, and bought all these things still spooks me. You would never know. My grandparents took me on a road trip and stopped in Shreveport to gamble. I sat on a bench and read for hours. It sounds shitty, but my attention span wasn't completely fried at that point, and I was happy to read as long as anyone would let me. Another kid, a couple of years younger, was in the same situation, but he was not a reader. We start talking, and eventually he starts telling me about the neighborhood animals he's tortured and killed. Cats, dogs, wild animals. He was an equal opportunity monster. I might have just been trying to impress a stranger. Might have had a crawl space packed with bodies. Who knows? When I was 12 or 13 years old, several young girls were AR'd and one was murdered in my city. We were told to be very careful, and they also gave us a very vague description of the murderer. The very significant traits that they knew of were that he had a darker complexion and two pale scars on his face on each side of his eyes. One day after school, I took the subway to go to the place where my mother used to work. It's on the edges of the city. It's not a busy area, so the subway was not crowded at all. I was sitting there waiting for my stop when I noticed the guy sitting 10 meters from me. He was wearing a hoodie, and I could still see part of his face, and one of the things I noticed were two pale scars, similar to what they described. He also had a darker complexion. As soon as I saw that, I immediately stopped looking, and I got off at the next stop, trying to look as calm as possible. It was scary, especially because I was close to one of his victims. Not me, but my coworkers actually worked with a serial artist or murderer who specifically targeted old ladies. They said he was quiet but nice. I even went out to lunch sometimes. When he got arrested, one of them said they had to call the police because it couldn't be him, and that it had to have been a mistake. Nope, there was DNA evidence. To be fair, he did stop his crimes after he started working there. I'm definitely sure I have one, because my cousin is one. We were quite close before it was revealed to me and the rest of our family that he's a monster, and our last encounter was in September 2020 when he hugged and consoled me at my dad's viewing. His death wasn't related to the cousin. Roughly 6 weeks later, he killed his final victim and was arrested 2 weeks after that. That's when we all found out the truth about him. This is definitely an encountered serial killer rather than pretty sure. I grew up in a small town in North Wales, UK. The local cinema had been closed for 15 years, but a guy from our town had reopened it. As kids, this blew our minds, as it was a rural area with very little to offer in terms of entertainment, so it seemed unbelievable to us that we would actually have a cinema in town. On one visit to the cinema, I ended up needing to use the toilet during a film, so I left the theater, walked through the foyer, and went into the toilet. There was no toilet paper, so I went back into the foyer and spoke to the cinema owner to ask if he had any toilet paper. I was younger than 10 at the time and very nervous about speaking to adults, but the owner was incredibly kind and friendly. She gave me the toilet paper, and we had a conversation about the film and how happy I was that we now had a cinema in the town. I used the toilet and then went back into the theater. A few weeks later, the friendly cinema man was on the front page of every newspaper. He was Peter Moore. Not exactly a serial killer, but when I was about 7, my sister and I became convinced our neighbor was a serial killer because he was coming and going at all hours of the night and constantly had his bathroom light on. My bedroom window had a view of the side of his house, so we wrote all our evidence on the window with Expo markers. A few weeks after our investigation began, my dad was out front mowing the lawn early in the morning when the neighbor came out and asked him for a cigarette. My dad said he didn't have one, so the neighbor kept walking. A little while later, we hear sirens. There was a man who always walked his little wiener dog around the neighborhood, kind of a local celebrity. He was walking around the apartment complex 2 houses down from us when the neighbor saw him and stabbed him to death. The guy never gave a motive aside from mental illness, but my dad's theory is that the neighbor really wanted a cigarette, and we all knew wiener dog guy smoked, so if wiener guy dog said no, that might have caused him to snap. He was arrested, but I believe he's getting out soon, so while he is a killer, whether or not he's a serial killer is TBD, I guess. I remember going out on a date with an older man who was already triggering my instinct for danger. At some point during the date, he mentioned that he was previously married to an Asian man who died very young. Then he spontaneously and excitedly went off on a tangent about how loyal Asians were, and how you could do literally any terrible thing to them and they'd stick with you. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You seem like the type of person to let me do whatever I want to you." I got up without a word and left, blocked him. That type of shit is why I use a fake name and set public meeting spots until I feel I can trust a person. Okay, one time I was driving home from the bar late one night. This car was behind, flashing his lights on and off. I pulled up to my driveway, and he stopped behind me. He said he was a peace officer and showed his badge. He said he needed me to follow him home because he told his wife he was out with a friend and wanted to show his wife his friend so she didn't think he was lying. I immediately said no, and he was so persistent. Mind you, this was at 3 a.m. I asked, "What the were you doing that you lied to your wife and followed a complete stranger home?" I said no again and went inside my home. I still think about that night. What a creep. Robert Lee Yates was an Army pilot flying OH-58s while I was flying UH-1s, same battalion but different company, at Fort Drum, New York. They would send us down to fly helicopter simulators once a year in Pennsylvania to maintain our instrument readings. We would carpool in one vehicle. Bob had a van with shag carpet in the back, so he would drive about 5 of us during those trips. It was about a 4-hour drive, so we'd joke and tell stories to pass the time. I was a fairly new pilot who enjoyed hearing the veteran pilots tell war stories. Bob was a CW3 at the time and was a bit odd, but nothing alarming. 18 years later, we see him on TV being charged with multiple killings of prostitutes across several states. He had used a Corvette and a van for the killings. Yes, that same van. I was at a shopping mall in Los Angeles when a man approached me saying he was a casting agent or photographer. Immediately I knew something was off with the guy because that's the #1 scam in the book, but he just gave off such vibes that I instinctively knew he was very dangerous. I politely took his card, made a mad dash to H&M, and hid in the dressing stalls. I alerted a staff member, and they had security walk me to the car. The gift of fear is real, trust it. About 2 months later, I had the news on in the background, then I saw his face. He had been arrested for abducting and murdering a girl from Michigan. He approached her the same way he approached me. Scariest thing ever. I believe there's a new Dateline podcast series out about him. I used to work in true crime television, and I can't even listen to the podcast because it freaks me out how close I was to this guy. As I said above, we have the gift of fear. For a long time, women were taught to be polite and ignore this, even if uncomfortable. It's super important to trust your gut, and as an MFM says, F politeness. My wife, then fiance, and I were out in Brooklyn one night, reasonably drunk, and hailed a cab to go home. The moment I sat inside, something felt wrong. The car seemed more bare bones than a usual taxi, and the driver had a strange attitude. There was also a slightly bad smell. The driver was kind of muttering under his breath and making these quiet burps. Every alarm inside of me started going off. I wasn't consciously analyzing it. I just knew it wasn't safe. The guy starts driving maybe 10 feet, and when I stop him, he says, "Oh shit, I left my bag in the bar." I grabbed my wife and pulled her out of the cab. The driver starts swearing and gets unreasonably pissed. Instead of waiting 1 minute for us to return, as a normal driver might, he immediately speeds off down the street. To this day, I'm convinced he was a serial killer or something similar, and that we narrowly avoided disappearing forever into the night.